The climate of planet Earth is changing. The natural order is being turned upside down. Millions of people are at risk.
Across our planet, scientists say the temperature is rising. And the weather is getting wilder.
Oh my gosh! It's another killer tornado!
Powerful storms are tearing through our towns, swamping ever greater swathes of land. And we are tearing down the trees that keep the air clean. More and more evidence suggests we're trapping the sun's heat in the Earth's atmosphere. It is parching land, depriving it of the water it needs and that we need. The creatures which share our Earth face new challenges. Our oceans are warming. Coral is dying, disrupting food chains. The ice that caps our Earth, north and south, is breaking down. Our seas may rise further and swallow land. The problems are piling up. They can't be swept away or buried. How we manage our changing climate, our own planet, will determine our future.
Doha, the Qatari capital, a city that's shot up on the back of vast gas reserves. Where once there was little more than a ramshackle pearl fishing town, now a sprawling metropolis in the desert, powering, transporting, watering and feeding a nation of nearly 2 million people. Here's Tarek Bazley.
Each year, billions of cubic metres of gas is pumped from Qatar's North Field, liquefied and then shipped abroad. It's the mainstay of the economy and the source of its extraordinary wealth. But Qatar's cheap natural gas is also used to generate electricity and desalinate water. Some of that water is used to green the desert, a daily soaking to keep grass and plants alive in summer temperatures that can top 50 degrees Celsius. Transforming Qatar's harsh natural environment into a green, lush garden like this is a gas-guzzling exercise. Qataris get free power and water, and it's highly subsidised for everyone else. As a result, people here are among the highest consumers of both electricity and water in the world. Qatar's small population, rapid growth and big carbon footprint means it's ranked as the world's worst carbon dioxide emitter by population, though it only contributes 0.25% of the world's emissions.
In most countries in the Middle East, energy is still incredibly cheap. That makes it pretty unattractive to actually use energy more efficiently. So clearly, one of the things that we need to see is movement on proper energy pricing.
At this year's climate talks, countries are being urged to sign up to binding cuts to their greenhouse gas emissions.
We are fully aware of the perils the world is facing as a result of climate change, and the UN Climate Change Conference will address the direct impact of climate change on food security. We hope the conference will produce tangible results and reinforce international cooperation.
Qatar has invested in green technologies like these experimental solar panels. It's also taken steps to reduce the practice of gas flaring or burning off excess gas. Along with desalination, flaring is a major contributor to its emissions. Tarek Bazley, Al Jazeera, Doha.
All populations that live at sea level are under threat from climate change, from here in the Gulf to the Pacific, where island nations like Kiribati, the Maldives, Micronesia, the Philippines and the Solomon Islands could become completely submerged. Coastal populations are all at risk in countries like India, China, Indonesia and Bangladesh, from where Nicholas Hack now reports on a community of climate refugees.
These children are attending school, but it's not just any school. Theirs is on a boat. All of them are climate refugees, forced to move from their homes due to rising waters. According to UN agencies, floods and torrential rains destroyed thousands of schools last year.
I don't want my grandchildren to rely on nature's goodwill to survive. They need to get an education so that they can leave this land.
The school is funded by a local charity. The goal is to ensure that the children still get a basic education. 8-year-old Shaun wants to become an engineer. He says he wants to build a wall to protect Bangladesh from floods.
By the time these school children become adults, 1/3 of Bangladesh's territory will be permanently flooded.
The Himalayan glaciers, source of all major rivers in Bangladesh. But because of rising temperatures, those glaciers are melting at an unprecedented rate. This, along with deforestation of the Indian subcontinent, causes the rivers downstream to overflow. And as Bangladesh is a low-lying delta, on average just 1 meter above sea level, people's homes and livelihoods are being destroyed. Under these waters is an entire village. Seasonal floods and torrential monsoon rains gradually wiped it off the map. All those old enough have moved away to find work. The young and the elderly have stayed on. Fazlur Rahman and his 2 grandchildren now live on a boat, floating above what once was their village.
Wherever I find space, I set up my home, but the floods keep submerging the land and destroying it, and I keep moving. I'm fed up with this.
As developed countries continue to pollute the air with carbon dioxide, global temperatures are predicted to rise by 4 degrees. These children face a future floating on water. Nicholas Hawke, Al Jazeera, Nator, Bangladesh.
Life on the rising waters of Bangladesh. But what about the rest of the world? Take a look at this.
Donc, regardez cet espace par rapport à la désertification.
In the 60s, this entire space was green, from here all the way to the foot of those mountains. All of it was filled with nomads and life. There were forests and wild animals, birds and antelope. This is total desertification. Everything has been exterminated.
This water comes from the springs that are fed by the glaciers. If the water is gone, we will all have to leave.
There was water 7 to 8 meters deep, full of lobsters and carps. Now our crops have dropped. There is no humidity and it rains very little now.
Every year, parts of the world are hit with devastating natural disasters. This year, weeks of torrential rain, flooding and landslides killed over 50 people across the Philippines in August. Drought struck the Sahel region of Africa. Lack of rain saw crops fail and livestock starve. In November, the east coast of the United States was battered by Hurricane Sandy. The storm hit 12 states. Well, we're joined now by Al Jazeera's meteorologist Steph Goulter. And Steph, the question is, we're seeing this big, bad weather going on, but is it right to say that the weather is changing around the world?
Well, just because you see weather in a few places change doesn't mean necessarily that globally climate is changing, because they're 2 very different things. One's weather and one's climate. So, for example, Qatar, our climate is a desert climate. I mean, what have you seen travelling around Qatar?
It's been pretty hot on the whole and cooling down slightly because we're coming into winter, I guess, but on the whole it's been pretty hot.
And that's predominantly our weather. It's hot and sunny. But that's not the only weather that we get in Qatar. We have sandstorms.
We have rain as well.
Exactly, usually from thunderstorms, and also some hail every now and then as well. So that's the weather, and that's not necessarily the same as the climate.
So does that mean that, although we're seeing these big bad weather events, the climate isn't changing around the world? Is that what you're saying?
No, just that weather and climate are different things. So just because one weather event has happened doesn't necessarily mean that the climate is changing. What you would notice, though, if the climate was changing, is that there will be more big bad weather events, and that is what we're seeing. In fact, I've got this graph here that shows the weather and the climate over the globe, how it's changed over the last 150 years.
Right.
You can see it's not a straight line. It's got all sorts of little kinks in it. And this little dip here, that might be when there's a La Nina event in the Pacific. That's when the Pacific waters are just a bit cooler than usual. And this little bump here, that could be due to something like the solar activity being more than usual, because every 11 years there's a solar cycle, so every 11 years we see more power from the sun. Yeah. So there's all sorts of things that would happen that would affect our climate.
Right, so up and down, but generally you can see the trend is up.
That's right, and that's the concern, because although all the natural wiggles are in there, the overall trend is upwards, and that's what we've seen.
We've come to the very northern tip of Qatar, actually not far from the vast North Field, just over the horizon there. It's the third largest gas reserve in the world, and it's changed the very course of this desert nation. There is still evidence around about Qatar of the old world, but there's not much of it. Life in the modern nation is very different here, and for the most part, it's been an easy change to make. The irony is that those communities being forced to change their lives because of global warming blame the very fossil fuels that have powered the industrialized world and have made nations like Qatar rich. I travelled to the far north in the Arctic to assess the impact of global warming there. We're heading to the far north, to a place where once the sea was frozen all the year round. But not anymore. All around the Arctic, the effects of global warming are multiplying. This is a gigantic glacier tumbling off Greenland's ice sheet near Ilulissat. It's hard to judge its size, but from top to bottom, that cliff face is 1.5 kilometers high. And it's moving, accelerating, and this in a year when nearly all the surface area of the Greenland ice cap melted.
The speeds that we're seeing at JazreaEnglish are quite fast. We're seeing speeds up to, I think, about 60 meters a day, which is faster than was observed in the past. So there's definitely things speeding up, but it's not clear that it's directly related to that warming event that you saw earlier this summer. It may be related to warming events that took place a decade or more ago.
At sea level, the majesty of the Arctic is breathtaking. It is just spectacular, isn't it? You can see why this whole area is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And you also get a real sense of the sheer scale, the sheer size of the Greenland ice cap. These colossal icebergs are just mere fragments of the ice sheet that have been toppling off into the ocean and are doing so in larger and larger numbers every year.
What we're seeing now is so much faster than anything anybody's seen before. It used to be in what they call geological time, you know, over many, many, many thousands of years.
Right.
Now we're seeing it in people's lifetimes. That's the difference.
We're already deep inside the Arctic Circle, but still we need to push 1,000 kilometers further north. This is Karnak, a community at the top of the world. To an outsider, things are very different here, where sled puppies chew on whale bones and children play in the midnight sun. Whale meat being cut up to feed sled dogs. There's little room for sentiment in the remote north. This is a way of life.
It's very important to me. In the winter, without dog, I'm nothing.
But this year, Mads had to shoot some of his dogs. The sea ice was so late coming, he couldn't hunt, and there was no food. And the ice gets thinner every year.
About 2.5 meters 10 years ago. Now it's only, only 1 meter.
Arctic life is very finely tuned. And although, as the Inuit say, winter will always come, it's getting shorter and shorter. The natural order is slowly but surely being turned upside down. Now, sunshine is one thing that the desert is not short of, but typically it's too hot to allow plants to grow, and there's not enough fresh water anyway. But here at the Sahara Forest Project in the south of Qatar is a pioneering new project whereby the energy of the sun is being used to water the plants and to keep the environment they grow in cool. The salt is taken out of the seawater and the process creates cool air in the greenhouses. And the end result is cucumbers. Still early days for this project, but all around the world, people are coming up with new ideas and new innovations in the battle to beat the consequences of global warming. Wayne Hay has this report from Bangkok.
Thailand's economy is growing and wages are increasing. That results in more vehicles on the roads and more pollution in the air. But the streets of Bangkok are already clogged. For the many food vendors who make a living on the roadside, the air can be toxic.
It is noisy and smoky. My health is getting worse. I often have a cold and a headache.
Respective governments have made inroads into the problem, converting taxis and some public transport buses to natural gas. But there is still clearly a long way to go, and policing of the problem is weak. Carbon monoxide levels have been reduced, but the amount of harmful particles has increased. Tucked away in suburban Bangkok, an architect and antiques collector believes he has a solution. It's a small device that attaches to any vehicle's exhaust pipe. He and his fellow inventors say it results in a cleaner, more efficient burn.
If we can suck out the bad air and replace it with fresh air, the engine can run properly. Our system creates a vacuum.
The device has caught the attention of some large companies, but they've said it needs some modifications before it can be taken further. Test results have varied, but the inventors say it will reduce fuel consumption by more than 1/3. The world's governments are meeting at this year's conference in Doha to try to hammer out a deal on climate change. However, there's little hope for any worldwide agreement to reduce emissions before 2020. The levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are steadily rising. But as long as there's innovation and ideas, the prospect of cleaner air will stay alive. Wayne Hay, Al Jazeera, Bangkok.
One of the main aims of the UN climate change talks is to get countries to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases they pump out. According to the latest data published in 2010, China is the world's biggest polluter. It emits over 8 billion tons of greenhouse gases. The United States comes in second, producing just more than 5 billion tons. But this amount has decreased since 2007. India's rapidly growing manufacturing sector has made it the third worst polluter in the world. It emits nearly 2 billion tons of CO2. And then there's Russia. It produced about 1.6 billion tons of emissions. You know, it's interesting to note that just 10 countries are responsible for 80% of the world's CO2 emissions, and most of them are also the world's richest countries, and it's the world's poorest nations that suffer the most. Let's hear from Gaur Rizvi, who is the foreign advisor to the Prime Minister of Bangladesh.
If a third of Bangladesh goes underwater, some 60 million people will be displaced. And what will happen to these climate refugees? They will spread in all directions. So the entire world has a stake in Bangladesh's concerns for climate change. To begin with, the developed world, industrial world, will have to understand that their current lifestyle based on consumption, huge wasteful consumption, is not sustainable. They must adapt to the new realities. They must pollute less, and the way to pollute less is to consume less, to waste less, and at the same time understand that global warming is a global phenomenon, and there will be no oasis. And therefore, we are all equally vulnerable to global warming, and therefore we need to work at it together.
So let's go to the United States now, a country where there is no comprehensive policy on climate change. It is the world's richest industrialized nation, and it's a country where scientists are now linking recent extreme weather events with global warming. Rob Reynolds has this report.
The ravages of Hurricane Sandy may top $50 billion, making it one of the costliest storms ever. No single weather event can be blamed solely on global warming, but scientists at places like the Earth System Science Center at the University of Maryland are drawing conclusions about the connections between extreme weather and the warming atmosphere.
Here's an example.
Antonio Busolacci is the center's director.
There's no doubt that the background climate around the world is warming. On top of that warming trend, we're going to have extreme events, and the two are actually conflated together.
This summer, a record-breaking drought ravaged the Midwest, destroying crops and boosting food prices.
It's estimated that about half of our growth in GDP this past year, half of it is going to be lost from the drought.
But severe weather is but one side of the cost the U.S. pays for burning oil, coal, and gas.
Literally, we're choking on our pollution, and tens of thousands of people die every year from mercury, billions of tons of sulfur dioxide, a whole host of pollutants. These are real medical costs.
Stunning as they are, those costs pale in comparison with the havoc rising sea levels could wreak on U.S. cities in the future, scientists say.
Houston, New Orleans, Miami, Washington, D.C., up in terms of the Chesapeake Bay of Potomac, Boston, New York, the big population centers, by design, are near water.
Scientists say if a storm the size of Hurricane Sandy were to hit Washington, this entire area, the heart of the nation's capital, would be underwater. And yet, efforts to enact a national climate policy remain stagnant. What is wanted, economists say, is a way of reflecting the true cost of pumping carbon into the air.
What we really do need is to look at something that's more broadly based in the economy. A carbon tax is probably the simplest way to do it.
In President Barack Obama's first term, efforts to set a cap on carbon emissions and require companies to pay for emissions over their allowed limit failed to get through Congress. The administration has cut emissions with higher energy efficiency standards for vehicles and appliances. But in his first post-re-election press conference, Obama said more progress won't be easy.
There's no doubt that for us to take on climate change in a serious way would involve making some tough political choices. If the message is somehow we're going to ignore jobs and growth simply to address climate change, I don't think anybody's going to go for that.
The science, economics, and politics of global warming are complicated, but one conclusion is simple. If we just keep doing what we are doing now, it's likely only going to get worse. Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Washington. Think of the just colossal quantity of waste mankind produces every single year all around the world. It takes a huge amount of energy to produce, and most of it just gets dumped into landfill. Recycling schemes like this one at Doha Plastics have not yet taken off in the way they need to in Gulf countries. They're only just beginning to happen. Believe it or not, this lot will re-emerge as oil barrels, road barriers, even seats for football stadiums. What you're looking at is recycling plastic, the byproduct of the oil industry. But still, the vast majority gets dumped, especially domestic waste. Of course, it's not only humans that are facing up to global warming. All kinds of wildlife are feeling the heat too, especially in the Arctic. I travelled across Baffin Bay from Greenland to Canada to explore the consequences of climate change. On the remote island of Kirkatat, a spotter is on the lookout for whales. Below, a hunting party has just returned. It's narwhal season. And first, they share pieces of muktak, or skin. Some money is made by selling slabs of muktak in Karnak, 2 hours boat ride away. It all helps this tiny community last out the year. You know, it's hard to reconcile the whole climate change movement with its conferences, its arguments over policy, its politics, its debates, with this tiny community deep in the Arctic, just doing what they've always done for hundreds of years. And yet, this is the front line of global warming.
Over the next few days, we head across Baffin Bay for the Canadian Arctic. Time for Paul, our onboard scientist, to take samples from the depths. While on the surface, the summer's record retreat of the Arctic sea ice is very evident. There's none to be seen.
The sea ice is really important for the life that lives here because it's adapted over thousands of years to the presence of the ice. So everything from tiny little single-celled creatures, the sorts of things that Paul's been studying on this trip, up to 100-ton bowhead whales, they all have their niche that relies on the ice and the flux of nutrients through that ice.
And as a crucial environment disappears into the sea, we make Canadian landfall at Grise Fjord and find a remote community whose beach is getting smaller.
The high tide, I can see big difference in it now. The shacks that are on the beach, they never used to be reached by waves, but now they do.
The big retreat of sea ice made it hard for us to see these guys, but Arctic veteran Pascal Otis has filmed them many times.
There's many encounters with polar bears over the years, feeding on shore on plants and whatnot.
And look at this one here with the two cubs following behind.
Yeah, that was a mother with two cubs, probably cubs that are 2 years old. They're quite big, so you can clearly see that they're just big, fat, and healthy bears.
Just how threatened are they? Because the impression that we get from the outside world, as it were, is that they're really under the cosh.
Well, I think that impression is correct if you're looking into the future as the sea ice recedes, because they rely so heavily on that sea ice. As one of the noted polar bear biologists has said, no ice, no bears.
As our trip ends, the physical impact of global warming is very apparent. Animal life is still abundant, but what will the warming seas mean for those species who rely on the ice? And what of those for whom the annual ebb and flow of sea ice is as much a part of them and their culture as the very blood in their bodies? There is no doubt the children of the far north are walking into a very different world from their forefathers. In this modern world, the need to balance the course of progress with an eye to sustainability and conservation is absolutely paramount. And that's a battle that's been fought out every single day, a long way from here in the Amazon, from where Gabriel Elizondo sent this report.
It's the most biodiverse place on Earth, the Amazon, making up a quarter of all the world's plants and animals, and with the world's second longest river, the Brazilian Amazon makes up 1/3 of the remaining forests left on the planet, but protecting this great treasure is a challenge. Roughly 8,000 square kilometers of rainforest are cut down in Brazil every year, brown blotches of clear-cut forest. Sometimes it's the iconic image of the Amazon to the outside world. Solving the riddle of Amazon deforestation is complex. Cattle ranching accounts for more than half of all deforestation, and Brazil is the world's second largest exporter of beef. As demand grows, so too does the demand for land for cattle to graze. And then there is agriculture, a major driver of economic growth in Brazil, but it's often competing for space with the forest. As you can see, there's still native forest that exists here. This patch is protected by federal laws. Now, it was just over 3 decades ago that the Brazilian government was actually offering financial incentives for farmers to colonize this area of the Amazon because they wanted to bring economic development here. As you can see, that's exactly what's happened. This is a huge soy farm. It goes on for as far as the eye can see, and there are literally thousands of them all over this region of Brazil. As Brazil's demands for energy increase, the government sees the Amazon as a source of energy and is building more than a dozen hydroelectric dams, which critics say has devastating environmental and social consequences. But government officials say that stepped-up enforcement has led to a 70% fall in deforestation in the past 8 years, and that roughly 82% of the native forest in Brazil is still standing. How to curtail illegal logging and how to balance the need for energy, soy, and beef against the need to protect the Amazon, that's a question for the world to solve, but no more so than in Brazil, a country blessed with the Amazon, but also with the highest responsibility of protecting it for tomorrow and beyond. Gabriel Lozando, Al Jazeera, Brazil.
Well, let's hear now from David Suzuki, a Canadian environmentalist and a global leader in the battle against climate change. We spoke to him from our studios here in Qatar.
When I first began to talk about climate change, which was in 1988, when climatologists meeting in Toronto said this represents a threat to human survival, second only to all-out nuclear war, and they called for a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. That's when I first began to get interested in this. At that time, I said, this is a slow-motion catastrophe. I was more interested in clear-cut logging and depletion of the oceans, and I thought that we could wait decades before we did anything about climate change. What has surprised me is that with only a 0.7-degree rise, we are now seeing absolutely monumental impacts in ecosystems around the world, including in the ocean, the change in fish, the movement of species up towards the Arctic Ocean. We're seeing an impact.
But let me just go to these talks, these climate talks here in Doha. How hopeful are you that there will be any substantive action here in Doha?
I'm not. As I don't have much hope for the meetings that we're in Rio in June of this year. The problem is very simple. Human beings think they're so smart and so important. We put our priorities, that is our political boundaries, our constructs like corporations and the economy and the market and capitalism, we elevate that above ecology. Ecology is this discipline that looks at what the conditions, the principles, and the laws are that regulate species' ability to survive and flourish. Now, I would have thought any intelligent creature would say we've got to put what ecologists are finding at the highest priority we've got.
Okay, when you say look at nature, what do you mean? What would you do to mitigate climate change?
I'm saying that climate is determined by obviously the concentration of carbon, the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere, and they have equilibrated over many, many centuries. We know in the past there are changes, significant changes that are correlated with temperature and climate. So if we want to try to retain some kind of stability and not go into climate chaos, then obviously we've got to pay attention to the amount of carbon we have put into the atmosphere and reduce it then to a level that can give us some sustainability. We're not doing that.
What do you think will happen if nothing is done?
Well, I have no idea. I listen to the scientists. We talk about, the calving of the great ice sheets from Greenland and Antarctica, which will, when they fall into the oceans, begin to rise not just in centimeters, but in meters, and that's imminent. We've seen the change in glaciers that are being rapidly depleted. What the impact of this will be on the water cycles, on the carbon cycles, on the nitrogen cycle, we have no idea. But we know that we're disrupting some of these great cycles, and the stability of the planet has been radically disrupted. Certainly, just from warming, we know that water expands. So thermal expansion of the oceans is inevitable as we begin to warm the planet. We're getting radical change in the Arctic in terms of the melting, the shorter periods of snowfall and freezing. The ice sheets are thinner each summer. We're absorbing more heat into the... We don't know what's going to happen. We can have all kinds of models, but we are disrupting the great heat and cold engines of the planet. The consequences are unpredictable.
The figures which show quite clearly that there has been no global warming so far this century, in the first 12 years of this century. They also show that during the last quarter of the last century, there was a very slight global warming, and it is likely that man-made emissions of carbon dioxide played a part, but scientists are uncertain as to how large a part that was.
We've still seen a record Arctic sea ice retreat this year. We've seen big weather events like Hurricane Sandy and so forth. There are climate refugees in Bangladesh. The Inuit people are seeing wholesale changes. Climate change, global warming is happening right now, and people, mankind, are feeling its effects, aren't they?
No. As I say, there's been no recorded global warming so far this century. What people are concerned about, and I understand that some people are concerned, what people are concerned about is what might happen in the future. But at the moment, there is nothing peculiar happening at all. You say that Arctic ice has been retreating. Arctic ice increases and diminishes and so on. What has actually been happening is that while Arctic ice in recent years has been retreating, the Antarctic ice has been actually growing and expanding.
But we're seeing a record sea ice retreat this year as far as the Arctic is concerned. But the thing is, overall, we have scientific consensus, or as near as we can get it. We have scientific consensus as near as we can get it, that the picture is much worse and you're portraying it.
No, there is no scientific consensus. That the scientists are divided. What scientists are concerned about, some scientists, the majority, but not by any means all of them, that there might be serious global warming in the future. If there is a problem, what is the sensible thing to do about it? And it is the measures that are put in place which we really have to focus on, and whether they make economic sense, whether they make scientific sense, whether they make political sense. And they don't, and which is why there is going to be no agreement whatever of any significance at Doha.
Isn't there a big danger here in what you're doing is just undermining the science, that in the end nothing might be done at all?
No, look, the science is very uncertain. It is quite clear that there is such a thing as the greenhouse effect, which means that the more carbon dioxide emissions that there are in the atmosphere, other things being equal, the warmer the planet will be. But two things are totally uncertain. Scientists admit it's uncertain, the good climate scientists admit it's uncertain, is how much warmer, and that is anyhow other things being equal. And of course other things are not equal. That is why there's been no warming so far this century, because there's been a rapid increase in carbon emissions and carbon concentration in the atmosphere, but other things have counteracted that. So the position is very unclear. But the point is, we use carbon energy, oil, gas, coal, not because we have a love affair with these particular forms of energy, but because they are far and away the cheapest source of energy at the present time. They have been for a very long time, and they're likely to remain so. Not forever, but for a very long time.
In 1990, a UN panel concludes that man-made greenhouse gases are increasing the temperature of the Earth. They call for action. After 7 years of negotiations, the Kyoto Protocol is born. All of the world's industrialized nations sign on. They pledge to reduce emissions to below 1990 levels. That accord finally takes effect in 2005, but by then it's greatly watered down. The United States, which initially signed on, does not ratify the deal and does not have to meet any of its obligations. And China, the world's biggest polluter, is not required to reduce emissions. The Kyoto Protocol expires at the end of this year. What comes next? That's partly what this summit is all about. This is the main plenary hall where all the big number speeches will be made. There'll be a lot of lobbying, a lot of debating going on here. And a woman who's going to spend a good deal of her time in this hall is Cristina Figueres, who's the UN Climate Change Chief. And I've already spoken to her in our studio here in Doha.
Governments need to ensure that the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol will actually start promptly on the 1st of January of 2013. They've already decided that it will, but they need to decide what are the rules that are going to govern that second commitment period.
It's not working, is it? CO2 levels are still going up, temperatures are still rising. The world's biggest industrialized nation isn't even acting on it, hasn't even ratified it, the United States. It's just not working.
Well, actually, the Kyoto Protocol is working if you see who is under the Kyoto Protocol. So developing countries are not under the Kyoto Protocol, so they have no obligation there. Who is under the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol are the industrialized countries, minus the United States that exited immediately, and Canada that exited later.
Why do you think the sense of urgency that's demonstrated by the scientists does not reflect on the way politicians are acting? Why is there this big gap?
There is a gap because the science, of course, looks at the planet from the atmosphere's perspective and sees the concentrations going up. The politicians see these decisions from their own respective countries' point of view. And they understand that they need to balance here, on the one hand, what science is telling them as a collective effort, but on the other hand, what each of them individually can do at that point in time.
So how do you narrow the gap?
I think you narrow the gap by the trend that we have been seeing over the past 2 to 3 years, which is more and more countries taking on nationally, legally binding climate change legislation because it's in their own interest. And that's the interesting thing.
Right, but that's the thing. Like, how are you going to get to that point when you've got somebody like the United States who haven't even ratified the Kyoto Protocol? You've got Obama, President Obama, saying that he doesn't want a future which is implicated by global warming. But on the other hand, saying that if mitigation means job losses, then it's a non-starter.
Because mitigation does not necessarily mean job losses, quite to the contrary. It means a birth of a whole new economy in green jobs that is going to bring new types of jobs, new opportunities to supply electricity, but also, very importantly, new export opportunities that are going to create not only jobs, but actually export economy.
That doesn't apply to a developing nation like India. If you applied the sort of restrictions that people are talking about, that it would impede progress, wouldn't it, and affect the lives of millions?
No, I don't think so. And nobody is expecting developing countries to impede their progress or to slow their growth. The opportunity here is to support developing countries in the growth that they must pursue, and nobody is questioning that because they must. They're only just coming in to their very accelerated growth. The difference is that these countries are going to have the challenge of pursuing that growth while at the same time reducing the carbon emissions, which means decoupling economic growth from carbon emissions. That's very difficult, and that is certainly not what the North has taught us, because the North did both of those two things together. So it's that decoupling that is going to be challenging, and for which the countries, in particular the emerging countries, are going to need support, both technically and financially, but it's doable.
Well, finally, what about the future for the Earth we all live on? As we look ahead to these climate talks, the truth is the gap between the action scientists say is necessary and what governments have actually done has widened. Emissions around the world are increasing, not falling. The planet has adapted many times before to global warming and cooling, and it will do so again. But will mankind? After all, there's nowhere else to go.